You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So Glenn, Donald Trump's probation interview is taking place today via Zoom. Trump is at Mar-a-Lago. So this is going to be used to determine the appropriate sentence. It's going to help with that process. So let's not bury the lead here. Let's say, for example, that Donald Trump is hostile during this interview, which I believe he's likely to be. Will that have an impact on the kind of sentence that Judge Merchan hands down?
You know, Brian, I think it actually will. It will put at least another couple of points in the incarceration column, because judges look to the pre-sentence report. That is the report that will be generated by the probation officer who is in the process of interviewing Donald Trump. The judge will look to that pre-sentence report to see, did the defendant cooperate, answer truthfully, fully, candidly, the questions posed to him by the probation officer. And, you know, if Donald Trump is, I don't know, nasty, dismissive, insulting, non-responsive, combative, you can bet Judge Merchan will see that in the pre-sentence report and will probably take very seriously the recommendation of the pre-sentence report writer. Because in every pre-sentence report that I have ever seen, and I saw hundreds of them in my 30 years as a prosecutor, at the very end, the pre-sentence report writer will make a sentencing recommendation. That recommendation could be probation. It could be incarceration. It could be a split sentence, a period of incarceration followed by a period of probation. And the judges take those very seriously. It's really an important piece of the criminal justice puzzle that judges rely on when they're trying to decide, okay, what sentence should I impose for these offenses of conviction and for this particular offender?
Generally, when the defendant who's been convicted shows a complete lack of remorse, does that play a role in the pre-sentencing report kind of showing that he or she should be incarcerated?
Absolutely. There are a number of accepted principles of sentencing. I teach this class to my criminal justice students at George Washington University. So things like punishment of the offender, that's an accepted principle of sentencing. Rehabilitation, or the rehabilitative prospects of the offender, another really important sentencing principle. Deterrence, which I know we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but let's take rehabilitation. Every judge who approaches the question of what is the appropriate sentence for these offenses of conviction and for this specific offender will educate himself or herself on, okay, what are the prospects that this person has been rehabilitated or is capable, susceptible of rehabilitation? These are the buzzwords that we use in the criminal justice system. Donald Trump would need to accept responsibility for his crimes, show some sort of remorse, contrition, apologize, pledge to do better. Do you think Donald Trump has the capacity or the interest in doing any of that? The answer is not only no, but hell no. And you can bet the judge will take Donald Trump's lack of remorse as an indication that he has exactly zero rehabilitative potential. So, you know, if he's not incarcerated, if he's just put on probation and left to his own devices, he will engage in this kind of conduct all over again, arguably. He already is trying to steal the 2024 election. So rehabilitative potential is a really important principle of sentencing, and some of what will be in this pre-sentence report will address Donald Trump's suspected lack of rehabilitative potential.
What about the fact that he is being prosecuted in 3 other criminal cases right now? Is that going to have an impact on the sentencing, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely relevant. Now, the most direct impact on a judge's sentencing determination is an offender's criminal history, and that is criminal history that has resulted in convictions, prior convictions. Donald Trump does not yet have any prior criminal convictions, but as you note, he's pending criminal prosecution in 3 other cases in jurisdictions both state and federal. That is fair game for the judge to take into account. However, because those cases have not yet been adjudicated, there is relatively little that Judge Merchan will draw from that, other than he was convicted in this case while on pretrial release in other cases. And even more importantly, Donald Trump committed 10 criminal contempt of court offenses during the course of this trial and in the run-up to the New York trial while he was on release in other criminal cases. These are the kind of factors and data points that Judge Merchan, I believe, will absolutely take into account when he's trying to fashion an appropriate sentence.
Glenn, walk us through the mechanics of how this probation interview is going to go. How long is it going to take? How much information is Trump going to have to give?
Yeah, so This is kind of a unique pre-sentence investigation and report. Ordinarily, when a judge approaches sentencing a defendant, the judge knows almost nothing about the defendant other than whatever evidence was introduced during the course of the trial. So it's usually limited to, the charged offense and the evidence the prosecutors put on to prove the case and whatever evidence the defense might have put on to try to defend against the charges. But that's pretty much all the judge will know about the offender. So once he's convicted, it becomes really important to give the judge all the information he or she, can possibly get their hands on to try to reach an appropriate sentence. So some of what this will look like is a real full-blown interview of Donald Trump. And what they're trying to learn about the defendant is educational history, family circumstances, employment history, anything that may indicate he has a problem with, for example, drugs or alcohol, any mental health challenges, any anger management problems he might experience, because part of probation, for example, can be ordering somebody into drug treatment, mental health treatment, anger management treatment. So it really is a full-blown investigation of Donald Trump's background, and then they put all of that together in a pre-sentence report that can sometimes span 15, 20, 25 pages or longer. And then that is all provided to the judge to give the judge some background and context about, okay, who is this offender and how should I factor into my sentence, this person's life circumstances. Some people have horrible upbringings, horrible childhoods. They're subjected to abuse. They have educational deficits, mental health challenges, addiction problems. All of that helps inform the judge of not only what the appropriate sentence might be, but what kind of help, what kind of assistance might this person need, for example, on probation? And, usually there's a good bit of leeway for judges to order the kind of programs that might assist an offender, particularly one who is sentenced to a period of incarceration, but then while on probation, the judge might order a series of participation in various programs that will sort of help the offender succeed once that person is released and is on probation and as they're transitioning back into the community. Now, this is kind of in the ordinary run-of-the-mill criminal case. All bets are kind of off when you're talking about a criminal offender, somebody convicted of 34 felony counts for trying to gain unfair advantage in a presidential election, who is, again, running for president and, looking to retake the reins of national power. So, all of this is to say it's unprecedented. We're in uncharted waters is kind of an understatement.
Well, Glenn, in terms of this probation interview, how is this going to be different given the fact that we already all know everything about Trump? Like, we know his family history. It's public knowledge. We know his criminality, his criminal history. We know everything about him because of who he is. So how is this interview going to be different then?
We all know it based on public reporting, but that doesn't mean the judge can just kind of read up on Wikipedia about Donald Trump and assume all of it is accurate and factual and current, up to date. So it really is important that a pre-sentence report writer gets as much information from Donald Trump, the defendant, the now convicted defendant, and what they will often also do is interview collateral sources, maybe some family members. Ordinarily, they might, for example, talk to a defendant's employer if the defendant was employed at the time of the crimes. So it really is called a pre-sentence investigation, and it generates a pre-sentence report. So yes, we know a lot of this about Donald Trump, but that doesn't mean Judge Merchan can just accept everything that he knows that's been reported in the press about Donald Trump. It really does need to be channeled and filtered through a reliable source of information, and that is what the pre-sentence report writer will endeavor to put together for the judge.
Will this report ultimately be public?
No. Well, I shouldn't say that. I say it in knee-jerk fashion. In the courts of Washington, D.C., pre-sentence reports are not public. I think that is true in most jurisdictions. I have a feeling that is also true in New York, but to be honest, I haven't practiced in New York and I haven't studied the laws and procedures surrounding the sentencing process in New York. But because it's often filled with somewhat sensitive information about, for example, mental health challenges, addiction problems, family problems during upbringing, it usually is not a matter of public record. Sometimes you might see a FOIA request put in to try to get a hold of it, get it released publicly. But no, generally these things remain matters, private matters that will never see the light of day.
Do you think that if this report does stay public, that will be more motivation for Trump to kind of take on a more remorseful tack here, knowing that he doesn't have to posture for people the same way he would have to if this was a public report or a public deposition?
No, Donald Trump will not show remorse. Donald Trump will not accept responsibility for any of his crimes. He was the one who famously said, as people were dying across our nation of COVID, I take no responsibility at all. The man doesn't have it in him. But here's what I suspect will happen, Brian, because based on some of the reporting, the procedures that have been put in place for Donald Trump's probation interview are pretty dramatically different. And generally, you and I have talked about this. I rail against Donald Trump being treated differently, being treated, in a preferential way by the system because of who he is. I'm not going to rail against that so much in the context of the interview for the pre-sentence report. Why? Because, I've been in the courthouse in Washington, D.C. when Donald Trump was present for a court hearing. And I can tell you, it so inconveniences the public, the court employees, everybody, not to mention it typically costs the city a whole lot of money because they have to call in all the police, they are put on overtime, they have to provide extra security around the courthouse, they have to close down streets. I don't mind that Donald Trump is being given this preferential treatment by not having to appear at the probation office in person in New York because, that will throw a monkey wrench into what is ordinarily going on in the New York courthouse. He's being allowed to sit in Mar-a-Lago, do a phone interview. He's allowed to have his attorney present. I believe he is foregoing a drug test, which generally is part of the pre-sentence report investigation process. And Todd Blanche, here's why this is a long run-up to more directly answering your question, Brian. I am quite sure Todd Blanche will shut down anything Donald Trump tries to say that might hurt Donald Trump in sentencing. And I've seen some variation of this over and over again when I was a prosecutor. The defense attorney will say, I appreciate the question, Miss, I believe it's a female, that's the reporting, female pre-sentence report writer. Miss pre-sentence report writer, I appreciate the question, but I'm going to direct my client not to answer that question. So he'll kind of be the buffer between Donald Trump saying stuff that could, inflame and enrage Judge Merchan because he's, railing against others for being responsible for his predicament. He'll be the buffer between Donald Trump's mouth and what Judge Merchan will actually ultimately see in that pre-sentence report.
All right. Well, we will obviously stay on top of this as this process continues to play itself out until such time as July 11th rolls around and we actually find out what the sentence is going to be. So for those watching right now, if you want to stay on top of everything up to and including the sentencing of Donald Trump in this prosecution, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.